23. God's speech in creation. 1. The First Vatican Council taught, God, the source and goal of all things, can be certainly known from created things, by the light of natural human reason. If we abstract from systematic connections perhaps made by conciliar fathers themselves and strictly consider the text they produced, the Council's teaching is simply traditional. So Thomas Aquinas, all things made by God are by nature such as, hiddenly to proclaim to us the divine reasons by which they have come to be. The Council, following the tradition, presented its teaching as an exegesis of Paul's argument in the first chapter of Romans, explicitly citing verse 1 verse 20, for from the creation of the world the unseen things, of God, have nevertheless been seen, through having become known in the creatures. We too may therefore appropriately begin our reflections with this passage. But for systematic purposes we need to have Paul's argument more fully before us, particularly the previous verse, for what is known of God is manifest among them, for God has made it manifest to them. We must note at the beginning that the knowledge from creation of which Paul here speaks is the knowledge that specifically the Gentiles have, or rather repress, and that its counterpart in the passage is the knowledge given to Jews as Torah, which according to Paul they also violate, though differently. Thus, the passage offers no immediate occasion or basis for constructing any layered scheme of natural and supernatural, or natural and revealed knowledge. The only question to which the Council in its dependence on Romans dogmatically directs us is that of a cognitive relation to God mediated by the creation to those outside the covenant with Israel, in a way parallel to that established with Israel at Sinai. Since those within the covenant presumably have both kinds of knowledge, they must for the redeemed stand in some relation, but Paul does not. Reflect on that. We must likewise be clear from the start that there is no question in Paul of a knowledge of God that human agents derive by intellectual operations on observed phenomena. That is, Paul has nothing to say for or against what modernity usually means by natural theology, or about what fathers of the Council may have conceived under some such label. If God is manifest among the Gentiles, this is because God has made himself manifest, just as the knowledge of God in Israel is the result of what he did at Sinai and by his prophets. And if then God has become known in the creatures, this is because in this case God uses the creatures in general to accomplish his revelation. We must be careful in reading Paul not to be led astray from his point by intellectual trends of our era, that have replaced a concept of revelation with a concept of truth as something lying within the control of the human rational agent. We must speak first of God's self-revelation by way of creation and only thereupon of a theology therein enabled. Finally, among these initial observations, we must note Paul's verbs and their mutual relations. The unseen things of God are nevertheless seen in that they have come to be thought through creatures. The language of the independent clause is that of apocalyptic. By way of the creatures God opens his unseen things to view, just as he opens a door to heaven for John in the Revelation. The dependent clause then specifies that the door in this instance requires no paranormal inspiration but is opened in usual ways of creaturely experience, though we must remember that this distinction is modern and not one Paul would have made. 2. Neither the conciliar declaration nor the points just made say how God gives us knowledge of himself by way of creation. They do not, that is, answer the question Western theology has traditionally had about the Romans passage. To join the text with this question, in a way surely not alien to the Council, we may appropriately turn to Thomas Aquinas' commentary on the text. In appropriating Thomas's exegesis of Paul, we will be guided by the contemporary construal of Thomas's theological epistemology, which does not start with his argumentative paths to God, vie in Deum, his proofs, as we are likely to call them. Insofar as the Summa Theologiae provides guidance for Thomas's commentary on the Romans passage, this is done not by the mere fact that its second quaestio contains cosmological argument for God but by Thomas's antecedent and founding stipulation, in the first quaestio, that all knowledge of God is dependent on divine initiative. That the arguments which Thomas does then adduce do not within themselves call on the gospel or Scripture does not by itself tell us how Thomas thought creation's mediation of knowledge of God works, particularly it does not say he thought it worked as moderns are likely to think it must. Indeed, Paul, according to Thomas in his commentary, does not attribute to Gentiles without faith an authentic knowledge of God. All competent knowledge forms the soul in some virtue, and competent knowledge of God forms the soul in love of God, which is precisely what Paul says the manifestation of God to the Gentiles has not done. Convicting them of this is Paul's purpose in bringing up the matter. The cognition actually present in the Gentiles is, according to Paul, according to Thomas, a cognition that is emptied and captive. Thomas can characterize this incompetent knowledge from several viewpoints. Sometimes he regards it as operationally equivalent to ignorance, though it can be called knowledge because it is culpable, sometimes as a potentiality. Waiting upon faith to become actual, so that he can gloss known in verse 1 verse 19 of Paul's text as knowable, and sometimes as idolatry. Thomas indeed supposes a continuity between what creation provides the minds of unbelieving Gentiles and the true knowledge that will subsist in faith if they come to it, so that he can call also the first real knowledge of God, in a certain respect, emphasis added. But whatever this respect is, whatever the epistemic quality of the knowledge which revelation in creation gives the Gentiles, their knowledge so gained is nothing they could use as a foundation for the knowledge of faith. All this established, it is now safe to ask how Thomas thinks God gives us knowledge of himself by means of creatures. That is, we may now consider Thomas's proofs for God, more accurately described by his own rubric for them as the mind's paths to God. In the commentary on Romans, he groups reflective paths to God under 3 headings. There is the via by causality. Creatures come and go in time. Just so they make us think of something faithful over time, on which they depend, since only by contrast with this thought do we apprehend their coming and going. If our thoughts follow this track, we think God's existence, the sheer fact of a first principle, that is, of a principle that is not one of the principles within created time. There is the via by excellence. The creatures show themselves jointly dependent on and so inferior to this first principle. Just so they make us think of this principle in its excellence. Reflecting on these lines, we think God's deity. And there is the via by negation. If we once have the thought of a supremely excellent principle and of his existence, the creatures show that they are not to be compared with him. Along this way, we think the various aspects in which God is incomparable, that is, we think his attributes. The ways do not start with a nature or world grasped from a position neutral to faith. Thomas, at least when commenting on Paul, presumes no such reality. Thinking along the via does not lead to God by recruiting him to the further explanation of a world initially grasped apart from him. Rather, it leads to God by recruiting the world to God's service in making himself known. It engages all creatures as possibilities of revelation of their own reality as creatures and of God as creator. It thus seems that the most natural way of reading Thomas's exposition of Paul on revelation in the creatures would be as a description of God's self-communication to us by them. And if we were to set Thomas's teaching within this category, it would be precisely congruent with that taken throughout this work. For Thomas, as in our earlier chapters, also idolatry and unbelief would be construed as perverse responses to God's in itself authentic address, an address that occurs also outside Israel and the Church and that calls all humanity to a goal that is in itself the same as that which faith grasps. Yet Thomas himself does not put it quite so, and we may again suppose we know why. The traditional interpretation of the Logos inhibits discourse about God's actual speech. The creation informed by the Logos remains for Thomas as for most of the tradition primarily an object of seeing rather than of hearing, and so an object to be worked up by our agency rather than an intrusion to which we must hearken. We have no need to share this inhibition, and for our encouragement Scripture contains an entire literature centered on divine speech heard in creation. 3. It is often said that old Israel had no talent for metaphysics. This patent error results from 2 prejudices. Dominant German scholarship, in the shadow of Kant, has often supposed that only positions materially consistent with those of the Greeks are metaphysical, so that, for example, a poem about hearing creation cannot be serious ontology, that it is not may then of course be regarded as a virtue. And modern biblical scholarship has typically slighted the so-called wisdom literature. We will be guided by exegete systematician Gerhard von Rad's remarkable meditation on some of the metaphysical wisdom poems. Primary among these poems is Proverbs, which we must brutally excerpt. Does not wisdom call, and does not understanding raise her voice? The Lord created me at the beginning of his work. Ages ago I was set, at the first before the beginning of the earth. When he established the heavens. When he assigned to the sea its limits. When he marked out the foundations of the earth, then I was beside him, like a master worker, and I was daily his delight. The wisdom who here speaks is initially the practical, ethical, and occasionally religious wisdom that Israel's teachers, rather than her prophets or priests, cultivated, as have those of all humanity. This wisdom is experiential knowledge of how things go in the world, whether in the earth and heavens or in human life. It is the wisdom by which kings reign and rulers decree what is just as it is the wisdom by which the young may attain maturity. In this passage, however, wisdom suddenly appears in a seemingly very different role. She is a personal voice somehow speaking from the creation and proclaiming herself as the wisdom by which God orders it. In the dramatic language of the poem, she presents herself as the architect at the builder's side. Experience of the world's ways thus turns out to expose us to the call of someone who addresses us with God's own wisdom. What we encounter by sober involvement with creation reveals itself as God's personal intent in creating it. Knowledge of such wisdom would indeed be more to be desired than silver, gold, or jewels. The one who ordered his or her life by it would track the very purposes God has built into the world in which we must live. The world's ordering wisdom is not, to be sure, available on the surface of things. It is in the creation and just so hidden in it. Another wisdom poem laments, or celebrates, wisdom's hiddenness. Humans with their observation and technology can probe many secrets of creation, but where shall wisdom be found? Mortals do not know the way to it. It is hidden from the eyes of all the living. Only God understands the way to it. Parallels to Greek logos speculations are obvious, and theology has sometimes exploited them. Yet the difference is profound. The meaning of the world is not, in these wisdom poems, available in the world to be worked out by us. We do not know the way to it. It is precisely a voice calling to us. As we observe this difference, we confront a question. The experience of the world's ways by which we may acquire wisdom is not, in Job and Proverbs, an experience mortals have at their disposal, and indeed wisdom's speeches are cast in the exact style of divine self-revelation. Yet the voice that speaks from the experience world is nevertheless not God's voice, and assuredly not that of a mediating entity between divinity and non-divinity. The speaker is explicitly one creature among the rest, but one who must be there for the others to make sense. Wisdom is the mysterious addition by which the world orders itself and just so turns to address itself to the life of humanity. And of course the most astonishing thing, to us epigones of the Greeks, is precisely that the created world order speaks, that it turns to humanity appealing and commanding, in direct address, as a personality. In their occupation with the wise order of the world, Israel's teachers encountered a someone who spoke to them of virtue and of God. The poems and von Rad's meditation on them leave us with the question, who is this speaker? Who is the creature who is the ordering instance of other creatures, who speaks from creation to us, and who just so speaks for God although she is not God? If previous positions taken in this work are correct, the speaker must somehow be a pre-existence of the incarnate Logos. His pre-existence, as we analyzed it, is in one mode a narrative pattern of Israel's previous story. Thus this mode of Jesus' pre-existence is just what we are looking for, a specific created reality within creation, which is the word by which God creates. Yet this answer will have to be refined, for while the incarnate Logos is a creature, as is the world wisdom, he is also God, which the world wisdom is not. A first refinement might be to move one Christological step to the side and say, the creature who speaks in the creatures for God is the Logos' human nature, insofar as the incarnate Logos' pre-existence within Israel's history posits his human nature as a determinate teleology within Israel's created history, and so as a determinate teleology of creation as a whole. This would seem to be even more precisely what we are looking for. Yet again there are difficulties. The idea of the Logos' human nature speaking on its own has a rather too Antiochean ring, nor can it be entirely without significance that throughout the poem's wisdom is obtrusively and consistently she. Finally, surely, we must say, it is the pre-existent reality of the totus Christus that is the creature among the creatures who make sense of the rest of them and whom Israel's teachers heard when the creation made sense to them. That is, Israel herself, as within creation the determinate possibility of the incarnation, spoke to her teachers. And following what we concluded in the previous chapter, we must say that Israel spoke to them from heaven, spoke to them from that created presence of the end within which she was already in full possession of her destiny. Heaven does not fall silent so long as the end is not yet. However we are to construe the relation of Israel and the Church, theology must appropriate in the present tense the experience of Israel's teachers. The body of the totus Christus is a creature that makes sense of the rest. This body is in the created heaven a self-possessed conscious creature. And this creature speaks through the phenomena Thomas observed, of creatures' dependence, inferiority, and comparability to something. It is thus that God reveals himself through our experience of creatures. 4. But now it is time to ask, how does it happen that in dealing cognitively with creation we hear a voice, however the voice is to be identified? To this question Israel's teachers provide no answer. They have heard the voice, report what she says, and in their situation have no further questions. According to Martin Luther, sun, moon, heaven, earth, Peter, Paul, I, you, etc., are all words of God, or perhaps rather syllables or letters in context of the whole creation. In this way the words of God are embodied realities, res, and not mere language. What God has to say becomes actual and not merely possible utterance, in that there are creatures. And Luther's choice of language to evoke this event is intentionally suggestive, for the chief context in which residential was a technical term for him was the doctrine of sacraments. In Augustinian sacramentology, as we have adduced it in other contexts, words in a language come to ritual objects, elements, and so there are sacraments. We may now note that this meeting does something for both the words and the elements become visible words and the words achieve embodied actuality. Thus if God wishes to speak to persons beyond himself, creatures are necessary for him, and not only in that there would otherwise be no auditors but also in that otherwise such speech would be disembodied and demonic. And then we may think of the other side of the meeting also and think of sun, moon and the rest as elements that may become visible words as interpreting words come to them. As for the word that comes to creation, to let the creatures be signs, we already know of it. This word is at once the word of the gospel that sounds in the church and the word of the law that sounds also outside the church. That is, when the creatures come to speak, it is as elements within the continuing moral and religious discourse through which God speaks to humanity and by which he makes us specifically human. Apart from this actual speech, the creatures would indeed remain dumb. Having asserted that last proposition, we must immediately mark it as contrary to even possible fact, for the discourse referred to is the word of God that creates all things in the first place, therefore there could in fact be no dumb creature. The being of creatures is precisely response to God's command, that is, it is answer. The creatures, we said in the previous volume, have their being not as phenomena, things appearing, but as legomena, things told of. The creation is not a cosmos that once it exists has a history, what God creates is a history. Within this understanding, the Bultmann school central notion comes into its own, and loses the ad hoc appearance we noted earlier. All events and all words are word events, there is no event that does not speak and no meaning that does not occur. That is real which has a future, and the future is there only an utterance that presents it. The creatures are to elements in the event that the spoken word of law and gospel brings them to visible speech. In the churchly sacraments we see how the creatures offer themselves to become signs of God. Water can be the sign of repentance and new birth because of its daily role to threaten and sustain and cleanse life, and bread and cup can be the sign of incorporation into Christ because of the place of eating and drinking in all community and because of their incorporation into us. How do the creatures as such offer themselves to be signs of God? We return to Thomas's vie. In their sheer contingency, the creatures betray, in both senses of the term, God's command that calls them forth. We have learned from Thomas some of the detail of this betrayal. The creatures are enduring and splendid and marvelously various. But simultaneously they provide ample opportunity to think of ephemerality, of imperfection, and of comparability. Just in this simultaneity, they provide opportunity to think eternity, perfection, and incomparability. And within the discourse that God sustains with humanity, the opportunity is always taken up, even if as the opportunity to capture and empty the thought it provokes, even if as the thought of baths not God. 5. No more than in the first volume dare we claim the knowledge of God without observing his hiddenness. And here again it is vital to avoid the great contemporary denial of Nietzsche, the supposition that God's hiddenness is quantitative, constituted in metaphysical distance from us, through which we may perhaps catch glimpses of the divine. God is not hidden because we can see only some of him through the metaphysical distances. He is hidden because his very presence is such as at once altogether to reveal and altogether to hide him. We may return yet again to Thomas. He teaches both that God as being itself is supremely knowable and even in this life is in fact known to us, and that in this life we can know nothing at all about God. For to know about something is to say such things as if it is intelligent, or it is a cathedral, or if it is heavy, it is to put the thing into a class of some sort. But God is in no class. He is the cause of the class of all things and just so belongs to none of them. If God belonged to a class, it would be the class of beings, but this gets us no further, for beings of course do not make a class of beings. But what knowledge do the Vai then bring us? Thomas's answer, because all things are God's effects, dependent on him as their cause and reason, we can learn of God from the creatures that he is, emphasis added, that is, simply that there is a first principle. All the attributes that Thomas then attributes to God merely, as we would now say, unpack the sheer assertion of his existence. To pick up the citation, we can learn of God that he is, and to know what must necessarily pertain to him if he is to be the cause of all things while transcending all his effects. In their deep logic, the propositions that we can in this life assert of God are therefore negative. Of God, we cannot know what he is but only what he is not. All such propositions, according to Thomas, work in the following fashion. There is God implies there is a first cause. If then there is a character F such that there is a first cause and some statement true of creatures, as for example creatures are composite, together entail that F is instantiated, we can go on to that proposition. In the present case, perfect simplicity is instantiated, which is the same as God is simple. Thus God is simple adds to there is God only a denial of one aspect of creatureliness. Yet the combination of such denial with the affirmation of God's being constitutes a very specific kind of negation. We have arrived again at the doctrine of analogy, now from the other side. We do actually know that God is simple, even if in knowing this we know nothing about him. We do truly predicate the word simple of God, analogously. Yet what it is in God, that we thereby denote, remains. We come to the word, hidden. To appropriate Thomas's teaching we must translate it in the same way as earlier. God both presents himself to us by the creatures and is hidden behind them. In the dominant tradition this is grasped by thinking of creatures as images of God, which both resemble him and do not resemble him. We need not altogether reject this thought, but by itself it is vulnerable to the antique and late modern interpretation of God's hiddenness as dimness caused by metaphysical distance. We will subordinate the dominant position to another also found in the tradition. Creatures, said Luther at the center of his theology, are masks of God, behind which he hides but through which he speaks. A mask is not supposed to resemble the one it masks, yet it is the medium through which the one masked addresses us. Just so are the creatures to God. God is not hidden from us by his absence but by the fullness and character of his presence. He is the Creator who fully presents himself to us in every event of his creation. What hides God are the sins and evils with which that creation is filled. As we saw in the first volume, it is God's moral intentions that are not as our ways that are incomprehensible to us and hide his goodness from us. True natural theology, actual knowledge of God in the creation, therefore, lives only in the great nevertheless the faith in the Creator. 6. But now, have we described a knowledge of God by natural human reason that answers to the teaching of the Council? That depends, at two junctures. We certainly have not described a knowledge of God achieved by a human cognitive activity within a realm of nature independent of grace. There is no such realm. We have not attributed knowledge of God to a rational capacity with an integral natural goal other than supernatural enjoyment of God, or with warrants of argument derived from such a goal. There is no such actual human goal. If the teaching of Vatican I requires the supposition of such a rationality and such a knowledge, either the council or fundamental positions taken in this work are wrong. But Henri de Lubac, by whom we were instructed to disbelieve in an ungraced nature, did not consider himself in conflict with the teaching of this council. The council's reference to a natural human reason is at least in part reference to reason as it functions. Also where the gospel is not heard. We have not here affirmed a knowledge of God possessed outside the church that is not idolatrous, though nor have we denied the possibility of its occurrence. But also, idolatrous religion, we earlier maintained, is response to the true God's speech and makes humanity vulnerable to him. What has here been affirmed doubtless would not satisfy some, or perhaps any, members of the council. But it need not for that reason fail to agree with what the council actually recorded as its teaching. Finally, we must return briefly to a matter raised in the very first chapter of this work. Natural theology appears often in the tradition as a branch of philosophy. Thus, the relation of Israel's and the Church's knowledge of God to natural theology is, in this construal of the latter, the same as the relation of theology to philosophy. But what is philosophy? Perhaps we may allow ourselves the conceit, philosophy is what disciples of Socrates do. In the earlier discussion we said that philosophy is the theology of Olympian, Parmenidean religion. The Christian theology deriving from the Gospel's penetration of Mediterranean antiquity is permanently constituted in the conversation, at once appreciative and polemic, of the Gospel claim with this religion. And now we must further note that Western civilization is the creature of that conversation. Within the branch of Christian history most, perhaps all, readers of this work inhabit, there will always be a polarity between two traditions of reflection, locked in permanent attraction and rejection. If we wish, we may distinguish these traditions as philosophy and theology. But we must be clear that this is not a distinction of genre. The relation is not symmetrical. Since the gospel is intrinsically a missionary message, and since Mediterranean antiquity was there before it was invaded by the gospel, Christianity is the intruder even in the civilization it co-created. Within the West, it is therefore possible to be a disciple of Socrates and not of the prophets or apostles, though it is not possible to be unaffected by them. So, there will be philosophers who are not Christian theologians, but within Western civilization. And so within the theological enterprise located there, it is not possible to be a disciple of the apostles and not a disciple also of Socrates. Therefore, the labels philosophy and theology cannot mark a real distinction for those most likely to read this book. 7. Petition and praise are response to challenge and blessing. These then are what all occasions say to us. By every actual occasion, the risen Lord says, there are possibilities. Ask, and there are marvels. Praise. That believers are able to hear these addresses, that we are able so to interpret natural spontaneity, depends on our knowledge of the risen Christ. That is surely the concluding thing to be said about creation.